In this lesson, we'll take a look at how we can set up the materials for the drool geometry. Alright, so here's where we left off. Now we've got the subsurface shaders pretty much applied. So now let's start to focus on some of these additional pieces of geometry. So in order for this to work properly, we want to make sure of a couple of things. Ideally, for this particular shader that we're about to use, in order for it to work correctly, you want to try to make sure that the geometry is not really intersecting the tongue itself. So let's select these two drops of drool that we've got modeled out here. And let's go to Modify Center Pivot. There we are. And now we can easily grab these and just pull these to where they're just outside the tongue geometry itself. And we'll check this other piece of geometry down here as well. It doesn't look like that one is intersecting with the body. Alright, so once we have these pulled out, we can now come in and start to apply the material. So I'm just going to open up this side menu, jump over to the metal ray nodes, and we'll add in the dielectric material. So this is a material that is actually really good for simulating sort of transparent refractive surfaces. So any kind of liquid, things like glass, this is a really good shader to use. So let's select these three pieces of geometry right here, and with those selected, we'll assign the dielectric material. Alright, so really as far as the material itself goes, there's really not a whole lot of alterations that we'll need to make on this. So we can come in and maybe just start to bump up the Phong coefficient just so that we start to get a little bit of specular highlight on this. And once we do that, let's just take a quick render at what we have right now. Alright, now once the render is complete, you can start to see that the actual drops themselves don't really look like any kind of a liquid. Really, they just have this gray background, or this gray color to them. Now, if we take a look at the alpha channel for this, you can see that these pieces of geometry are actually cut out. So this is really a two-part problem. So one of the problems that we have is that the geometry that comes in from ZBrush is actually disabled as far as the visibility in the reflections and refractions. So to fix this, we can select the geometry, take a look at the render stats, and if you take a look at the render stats, you'll see that visible and reflections and refractions are both turned off. And again, this is just a problem with the geometry that comes in from ZBrush. So we need to go in and pretty much enable that feature for all this geometry. Now, rather than having to select all this geometry one at a time and enable these features, we can do this through the attribute spreadsheet. So let's just select all this geometry, and we can do all this in one shot by going to Window, General Editors, and down to the Attribute Spreadsheet. There we are, and we'll take a look over in the Render tab, and you can see that we pretty much have access to all of the different attributes for double-sided, opposite, smooth shading, and so on and so forth. What we want to do is find the attributes for visible in reflections and visible in refractions. So we can just simply click and drag on the top of both of these columns in order to select both of them, and with this selected, we can either type the word on to enable both of these features, or if you just want to simply type in 1, you could simply press 1, which is the shortcut for on, or 0, which is the shortcut for off. There we go. Now that we have this turned on, let's take a look at what we have now. Alright, so we can see it does look a little bit better than what it did before. But now that we have the ability to be visible in reflections and refractions turned on, now in addition to that, we also have to go in to the actual render settings. And if we take a look inside the Quality tab, if you're using Maya 2009, this is where you'll find the setting that we're about to go to or jump to. We'll scroll down and look for Ray Tracing. And you can see right now the number of reflections and refractions are both set very low. So basically what that means is for the ray tracing ray to pass all the way through this geometry, which is what we would want it to do. Instead, it's just simply striking the outermost surface of this drool geometry and then reporting back to the camera. What we want it to do is have enough ray interactions to where the ray will hit the outside surface of this, hit the backside, and then continue through and report the information of what's behind here. So to do that, we need to increase the number of reflection and refraction rays. So we'll make sure we set this sufficiently high, something like 4 and 4. And then for the max trace depth, we want to make sure that it's the sum of those two values. So in our case, something like 8. Alright, so let's see what that does for us. There we go, and now that looks much, much better. We now have something that looks a little bit more liquid-like. Okay, so let's actually, while we're in the process of adjusting some of these render stats, let's go back and do the same thing for these eyes. You'll notice that right now we do have across the top of these eyes an actual shadow that's coming from this tentacle and the fish itself. And you can see kind of where that shadow from the fish is falling right on this squid's face. So let's go in and adjust some other render stats. Let's select the eyeball, and let's make sure that it is set not to receive any shadows. And we'll do the same for this other eye, so that way we shouldn't get any shadows that are cast. And let's also take this fish, and let's disable its ability to cast shadows, so that way it shouldn't be casting any shadows onto this surface or the tongue. So now with that, we can save what we have and re-render for comparison. Okay, so you can see that is now much better if you compare what we had before to what we have now. Although it doesn't completely eliminate the problem, you can still see that there are some shadows that are falling on this squid's face as well as the backside of this tongue. Now this is probably being caused by the actual eye geometry in this fish right here. So let's try grab that. And just to make this a little bit easier, we can disable the gate so that we can grab this. There we go. And let's disable its ability to cast shadows as well. And we'll do the same thing over here. Disable its ability to cast shadows. There we are. So let's take a look at what we have now. Alright, excellent. That's now looking much, much better. You can see that without the shadow casting of this fish or the eyeballs, how we start to now get a much better shadow, or rather the elimination of a shadow across the eyes and across the front part of his face, as well as now removing the shadow from this top part of the tongue, and now starts to clear the way for us to get some of the specular highlight of this backlight that's back behind here. And again, just kind of starts to now contribute to this overall wet look of the tongue. Alright, now speaking of the tongue itself still seems to be a little bit dark in comparison to the rest of the body, so what we can do as a way of introducing a little bit of additional subsurface scattering onto this is to take a look at the tongue itself, and connected to each of these light maps is the ability to include any kind of indirect lighting. So this is another way that it's somewhat beneficial to have each piece of geometry, or each major piece of geometry, have its own light map. So that way you can choose whether or not, on a per object basis, whether or not we want indirect lighting to be written into the subsurface result. So I'm going to select the tongue, take a look inside the fast light map, and enable include direct lighting, so that way we can start to get some of the effect of the final gather that is written into the subsurface result. So let's save this for comparison and re-render. Alright, there we go, much better. So now you can really start to see the subsurface effect that's starting to take place here if you compare what we had before to what we have now. Now this final gather result is a little better written into the subsurface result. There we go, and that just kind of gives this tongue a little bit more of a translucent effect. Alright, so we're starting to make pretty good progress. Overall, though, our lighting result is still fairly rough, but again, we're really kind of sacrificing quality in order to gain rendering speed, which is really what we're after at this point. So now that we have things pretty close to where we want it, we'll start to now just include some textures on a few of these final pieces, and start to now begin the process in the next couple of lessons of now beginning to increase our render quality by starting to now introduce displacement maps and starting to bump up the quality on our lighting as well. So through the course of the next several lessons, we'll start to kind of unravel that process.